Okay, without further ado, we're going to stay in Latin America, and we are going to be talking about the Venezuelan election. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm first going to run through the basics really quickly, and then I'm going to get into a more complicated, detailed explanation of the situation. The Venezuelan election will take place on July 28th, which is a Sunday, tomorrow, for those of you who are listening today. And the winning candidate of the election will take office 6 months after the election results, so in January 2025. Venezuela is a federal presidential republic, like the United States, with an executive, legislative, and judicial branch. Of course, that is in theory. Right now, they're more like an autocracy. But anyway, now the president in their elections is elected via a plurality, which basically means whoever has the most votes wins the election, and the winner will stay in power for 6 years, unless they die, of course. Now, the basic rundown of this current election is that the incumbent Nicolas Maduro of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela is a dictator who has made life awful for Venezuelans, and now the opposition is united against him, with Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia of the Democratic Unitary Platform running against Maduro. Now, the opposition is way ahead of Maduro, according to the polls, with some polls having him up by more than 20%. And the most recent polls that I saw, conducted by Mega Análisis del Fores and ORC Consultores, show that Gonzalez is actually up by 60% in the polls. Now, with 66% of eligible voters expected to turn out, if there is a fair election, it seems like the opposition will surely win. But the key question is, will it be a fair election? And if it is, will Maduro agree to give up power in January? Now, for what it's worth, the last election in 2018 was deemed illegitimate by 14 Latin America countries, as well as the US and Canada. And Maduro, this time around, has said that Venezuela would descend into, quote, a bloodbath if he lost. So that's the basic rundown. Now we're going to get into some specifics. So I mentioned that life has been awful under Maduro. So let's start talking about the economic troubles. So Venezuela has a high debt of about $150 billion. They have hyperinflation. They have a shrinking GDP, although it's been slightly better in recent years. They have a shortage of goods, and 50% of Venezuelans live in poverty as of 2023. Moreover, 9.3 million, or a third of Venezuelans, face food insecurity, and 7 million of them are in need of urgent humanitarian assistance, according to the UN. And you can see in this graph that both poverty and extreme poverty levels have skyrocketed since 2013, when Maduro came into office. Now, another aspect of Maduro's terrible regime has been the violence he's used against people. So an Amnesty International report in 2018 concluded that Maduro's government committed the worst human rights abuses in Venezuelans history, with upwards of 20% of homicides in Venezuela being committed by government security forces, with the majority of those occurring in poorer Venezuelan communities. Additionally, Maduro faces criminal charges by the U.S. Justice Department, and he is under investigation by the ICC for crimes against humanity. Because of this, and also because of the economics situation, almost 8 million Venezuelans have fled during Maduro's presidency, and 40% of polled Venezuelans have said they would leave the country if Maduro stays in power. Now, the other issue is corruption under Maduro. I don't know why I said it like that. Corruption. According to transparency.org, our friends from the Bangladesh story, Venezuela's corruption since Maduro has come into office has fell from a score of 19 to 13 out of 100. And Venezuela is currently ranked 177 out of 180, or the fourth most corrupt country in the world. Now, 19 is not a good score either. So as you can see, corruption was prevalent before Maduro, but it's got even worse during his presidency. Maduro also faces drug trafficking and corruption charges in the U.S., and the New York Southern District Attorney has accused Maduro of conspiring with the FRAC, which is the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, to facilitate the entrance of cocaine into the U.S. So, not good. All right, now let's talk about the opposition. So, as I mentioned, the opposition candidate is Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia, who's a former diplomat for Venezuela and who has been billed as a bird-loving grandpa. His platform goals are taming inflation, rebuilding trust in institutions. His platform goals are taming inflation and rebuilding trust in institutions. Now, he's really not a particularly impressive candidate. He's kind of weird in interviews. He does this thing where he answers questions with a single sentence and very abruptly. So it's quite awkward for the interviewer because they don't know if he's done or not. And there's this like long pause before they ask another question. So he's not particularly impressive, but he's also the third choice of the opposition. So he's the candidate they wanted the third most to be their candidate. And the reason he is running, even though he's the third most wanted candidate by the opposition, is that their main choice, Maria Corina Machado, who won the opposition primary with 93% of the vote, was actually banned from running along with the second place candidate. Maduro used the courts to bar them from running in the race. However, it is really still Machado leading the campaign. So even though Gonzalez is on the ticket, it's really Machado who's leading the campaign and is galvanizing the opposition. Now, who is Maria Corina Machado? Well, at first glance, she is a conservative politician from a wealthy family. She greatly admires Margaret Thatcher and has even earned herself the nickname in Venezuela, the Iron Lady, which was Margaret Thatcher's nickname. She believes strongly in the free market and in capitalism. She's also friendly towards the U.S. In her previous work, she has received assistance from the U.S. and would likely have a pivot more to the U.S. if the opposition win. If elected, she said that she plans to privatize PDVSA, or Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., which is the state oil company. And she's also said that she wants to build welfare programs to help the poor. And finally, she has said that she wants to, quote, bury socialism forever. So a big change from Maduro. And the last thing you need to know about the opposition is that there are some other candidates besides Gonzalez and Maduro running, but they have very minimal / insignificant support, and many people just view them as being in the race because the government put them there to take votes away from the real opposition. So they're just government agents or allies who are there to take votes away from Gonzalez. Which, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but if true, it's a very, very interesting and I guess dangerous tactic, and something that maybe we can talk about a little bit more. But what I want to talk about now is go into a little bit more depth about Venezuela's economic problems. So, although Venezuela's economy has gotten much worse under Maduro, the truth is that Venezuela's economic problems did not start with Maduro. Okay? Despite having the largest oil reserves in the world, poverty was a big problem before Maduro, before Chavez, who was his predecessor. In fact, the reason Chavez was able to win the presidency was largely because poverty was so rampant in Venezuela. And he campaigned on a platform of reducing poverty in Venezuela. And as you can see from this graph, again, poverty has skyrocketed under Maduro, but it was also very high and prevalent before Maduro and before Chavez. Now, again, to understand Venezuela's economic problems, we need to understand the problem that it faces, because they have the largest oil reserves in the country, which seems like it'd be a really, really fantastic thing, right? Having the largest oil reserves in the world would bring in a lot of cash. However, having a huge amount of oil reserves can be actually what Elvis calls a devil in disguise. Because although the oil can generate huge amounts of profit for Venezuela or for any given country, and it has generated huge amounts of profit, as it makes up right now roughly 60% of Venezuela's government budget, it can also cause Venezuela, as it did, or other countries, other industries to be ruined or severely damaged in what is commonly known as Dutch disease. And this is the disease that has inflicted Venezuela. So let's talk about Venezuela. Let's talk about Dutch disease and break it down. So Dutch disease basically occurs when you have the discovery or the presence of massive amounts of a highly valuable commodity that people want. And as a result, because people want to buy that commodity, huge amounts of foreign capital pour into that country. Now, this leads to an appreciation or a high valuing of that country's local currency. So, if a country has a currency called Athens, right? And they get a lot of money and a lot of foreign capital comes into the country that has the currency Athens. Well, what will happen is one Athens will suddenly start being worth a lot more around global markets, right? So everybody's other currency will start to go down relative to the Athens. So I can buy a lot more with Athens if the value of the currency goes up than I could before. Now, part of the problem with this is that when the value of the currency goes way up, what happens is exports from the country are actually severely hindered, right? Because it's harder for people, well, it's easier for you to buy other people's product with that currency. It's harder for you to sell other things to other countries because your things are more expensive, right? So, of course, this doesn't apply to the very valuable, like, commodity or thing that you have, in this case, oil, right? People are still going to buy your oil, but they're not going to buy products or goods from your other sectors, or it's more difficult for you to sell them because they are more expensive to other people, again, because your currency is worth more. So what this leads to is these industries like agriculture, like labor, they suffer, right? And they grow smaller and weaker because they don't have as many markets to sell them to, right? They don't have as many buyers because it's more expensive for people around the world to buy things. So when there's less demand for your product to sell, you start producing less. And when you start producing less, well then, number one, the industry shrinks. And number two, because the industry shrinks, you have less and less jobs, which can lead to unemployment. Now, the flip side of this is that even though you can't export things as easily, you can import things very easily. So when your currency is very high, you can make up for the fact that you're not producing things like crops, agriculture, etc., by the fact that you can import a lot of them from other countries because those things are incredibly cheap for you. And now there's also that double effect. Well, if people are importing things that are very cheap to them into their country, well, then the locals are not going to buy the local products being produced because it's more expensive to them than importing stuff from a cheaper thing, right? Because if you're living in a country and the value of your currency goes up, it doesn't change the value of things from people living inside that country, right? 6 Athens still means 6 Athens to the people living inside. It's only changing for people in the international community outside. So right, when the currency is high, you can compensate for not producing a lot of these goods by importing everything. And that's what Venezuela did. However, this is a catch-22, right? It's a big problem when you're relying on imports for goods. Because as I've mentioned, there's unemployment, but the other part of this is when the value of that commodity falls, in this case, when oil prices fell, then the country, in very layman terms, is fucked, right? Because the value of the currency is no longer high when the price of oil drops. So they don't have as much money. And when they don't have as much money, then they can't afford to buy or import as much as they were doing. So that leads to food shortages and goods shortages for everybody. And that's exactly what has kind of happened in Venezuela, right? When the oil prices are really high, Venezuela can import a ton of things and make up for the fact that they're not producing a lot. But when the value of oil is low, not only do they face severe unemployment and they're in trouble because their industries have shrunk and they're not producing a lot, but they also can't import that stuff as much. So there's huge amounts of food shortages for people, which makes life really difficult and awful. And it also makes people poor, right? Because they don't have jobs and the food that is in the country is really expensive. to them, so they can't buy many things. So they don't have jobs, and things are really expensive, which leads to a really disastrous situation. And things are not being produced, as I said. So there's just terrible, terrible, terrible situation. And that has kind of been Venezuela's curse, well before Maduro. Now, Chavez, the guy before Maduro, he was actually able to reduce Venezuela's poverty by about 20%. And I'll show this graph again. You can see, right, actually, this graph only goes to 2002, but Chavez came to power in 98 and was in government until 2013. And he was able to reduce poverty. But the problem was the way that he reduced poverty was by spending, overspending with oil money, right? He used oil money to create industries, massive amount of government agencies and industries to provide services to people. And he also used subsidies. He subsidized all of these industries, like agriculture, food, housing, etc., to keep these industries afloat, right? He very simply, he used a ton of money from oil and spent it to subsidize and provide services for people. And that helped reduce poverty. However, the problem with that, again, it's the same trap, is when oil prices then fell, well, then the government is not able to continue to do this same stuff. It's not able to subsidize all of these products and all of these agencies and industries that it was funding before with the oil money. It's no longer able to fund. So either these agencies or industries fall apart, or Venezuela accumulates massive, massive amounts of debt, which has been Venezuela's story. So again, in summary, although Venezuela's economy has gone significantly worse under Maduro for a variety of reasons, it still has a fundamental problem that has existed before Maduro. And so when we move to what's next for Venezuela, first and foremost, Venezuela is going to have to find a way to diversify their economy no matter what, and find a way to produce money that's not just from oil. Whoever the new president is, they're going to have to do this. But of course, they also need to find a way to get Maduro out of office. Both they need to beat him legitimately, which they'll likely do, but more importantly, they need to find a way to get Maduro to agree to leave office or to accept the election results. And if they don't, well, then maybe they need to find a way to oust him with the help of the military, potentially. Although I think that would be more chaotic. And the best situation was that they could find a way to get him to leave or to agree to leave. Now, I'm no expert in Venezuela. I don't pretend to be. I don't pretend to be an expert in Latin America politics. But what I will say is, in a guest essay for the New York Times, Roberto Patiño, a member of the Venezuelan opposition, argued that the U.S. should create a legal off-ramp for Maduro to incentivize him to accept the election results. Now, for what it's worth, I think this is a good idea. I do. And I think if the U.S. can help create this legal off-ramp to get Maduro to leave, it would both benefit the US and Venezuelans. So for those of you who are listening from the US and you want to know why you should care about this, again, primarily we're trying to help Venezuelans, but selfishly, right, we can think about why it would help us too. So, as I mentioned, 40% of those polled said that they would flee Venezuela if Maduro stayed in power. That probably means a lot of people coming to the US border, and we already have a border crisis, so that would likely add to the chaos and the crisis that we have, which it would be better, right, both for them and for us if we didn't have to deal with that. The second thing is I mentioned the allegations of cocaine smuggling into the US that have been orchestrated by Maduro. So it would reduce the levels of cocaine coming into the US, which is obviously a good thing. And then the last thing is if Venezuela is pro-US and if it finds a way to have a strong economy, then Venezuela could potentially be a good balancing force against China and Russia. Now, currently, Venezuela is aligned with Russia and China, but the opposition winning and coming to power would likely signal a shift back to the US. And, you know, with huge amounts of oil money, they could help potentially lower costs in the US than other parts of the world, particularly as Russia is no longer an option for many parts of Europe. Now, also, for all the reasons that I've just mentioned previously, having Maduro out of office would be great for Venezuelans. But also, if the opposition won, it might allow Venezuela to tap into U.S. and Western oil markets, which they have not previously had access to under Maduro, which may help Venezuela's economy. But again, they still need to find a way to diversify. So that's it. As usual, if you are from Venezuela and are a local and have additional thoughts, please let me know. Please comment below. Please add suggestions, anything you want, insights, etc. You know, I'm no expert in this stuff, and I would love local insights. So please leave that and any other thing in the chat.